was being very intentional. Why would he keep repeating the same words over and over again in every single letter he wrote? Why would he use the exact same words to speak to every person that he met? Now, you should know, for example, that the word grace was not the common greeting for people in that time. The way that you would greet somebody in the Greco-Roman world is you would walk up to someone and you would say, Kyrie. And Kyrie meant, how are you? Hi. What's up? That's what Kyrie meant. Paul changed the word from Kyrie, and it's very similar in the original language. You don't see it in the English, but it's from Kyrie to charis, which is grace. And I have a feeling the people who heard the Apostle Paul speaking to people around him, or to hear the church speaking, they would say, isn't it interesting how these Christians respond to each other? They always speak words of grace and peace to each other. They don't just say, hey, how are you doing? They speak a blessing into each other's lives. There's a very different way. And I want us to think for a minute about why did Paul say grace and peace, and why are we called to be grace and peace people? Let's think first of all about what the word grace means. If I were to use the word grace, most of you would know that that's a Christian term in some ways. My favorite definition of grace is undeserved favor. It's the favor that's given to someone who deserves the opposite. So we deserve to be treated one way by God, but God in his grace chooses not to treat us as we deserve, but he chooses to treat us with mercy. He chooses to greet us with unconditional love. So grace means gift. Grace means undeserved gift. So if I were to give you a gift and say, hey, happy birthday, I want to give you this gift, and you were to say, oh, thank you, that's kind of you, but how much do I owe you for that? I would say, no, it's not. It's a gift. It's not a transaction. The moment you start talking about grace in transactional ways, you've automatically changed the meaning of grace, because grace means undeserved gift. Grace means there's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you less than he does right now. You can't be a better person and have God say, I love him more today than I loved him yesterday. Why? Because God's love for you was never based on your behavior or your performance, so how could your better performance change the way he loves you? The reverse is also true. God loved you before you loved him anyway, so how could your bad behavior cause him to love you less anyway? So you being a better person or a less good person, that doesn't change how God views you. That's called grace. Nothing changes God's view toward you. Now, you can have consequences for bad behavior or for sin. Of course, there's consequences, but it doesn't change God's perspective about you. That's what grace means. So here's my question for you. What does it mean to say to another person, may God treat you better than you deserve? Let's think about the other word, peace. Peace is also a Greek word, but it comes from a Hebrew word, which is one that probably most of you know. It's the word shalom. And shalom, it means peace, but it doesn't mean the absence of conflict. So whenever we talk about peace, we don't mean that everybody's getting along perfectly, there's no disagreements, that there's nobody who has different opinions. That's not what peace means. If that's the kind of peace you're looking for, you're going to be really disappointed and frustrated. But that's not biblically what peace means. Here's what shalom means. Shalom means completeness. It means wholeness. It means every part working together just as it should, in perfect harmony together. That's what we're talking about. When we talk about peace, we're talking about God taking the broken pieces of our lives and all the disjointed parts that have been fractured by living in the world that we live in, and how God in his mercy puts them back so that you become the person he intended you to be, to have a life of fulfillment and purpose. That's what we mean when we say shalom to another person. So question, what does it mean to say to another person, may God take the broken pieces of your life and put them back together again? treat you better than you deserve. And may God take all the broken stuff and make it whole again and help it to have purpose again. That's what it means to say grace and peace to you. And I want to tell you that what it means to be Christian, what it means to be part of the church, is that we are people of grace and peace. We don't just believe in grace, we don't just believe in peace, but it's how we speak to each other. It's how we act toward one another. And not just toward one another, but to anyone, to even those outside the faith. We are known as the grace and peace people. And that's why Paul said, this is how I want you to treat each other. Don't just say, what's up? How you doing? How about those sinners or whatever it is? That's okay to have those conversations, but anybody can have those conversations. The church is the grace and peace people. So what does it mean to live in a world where there's not grace? And where there's not peace? I mean, you just have to spend 5 minutes on social media to know that there's not grace and peace in the world. And that's just among the Christians. We live in a world where there's not people are treating us as we deserve or worse. We live in a world where people are not wishing wholeness for us. If we don't agree with some people, it's like we've just kind of alienated them out of our world. That's not the voice of the church. That's always been the voice outside the church. That's nothing new for the world, but that's not who the church is. So what does it mean to be grace and peace people as an SNU community, as people wherever we find ourselves who represent and who are ambassadors for Christ? So it might be easier for you to understand it let me tell you a couple stories, examples of how I've seen grace and peace in my life. I was pastoring this church, and I was sitting in my office on the 3rd floor. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning, and I went, oh no, I forgot. Today is my son's 16th birthday. And that's a big deal when you're 16, especially here in the U.S. That's a mile marker day. And I let him go to school and completely forgot to tell him happy birthday. I said, my son's going to go to school all day long and he's going to think my dad doesn't love me. And so I jumped in my car and I drove the half block over to Bethany High School. And I went into the principal's office and I said, hey, is there any chance you could call Ben to the office? And the principal knew me and we had a good friendship. He said, of course. And I wasn't prepared, though, for how he was going to call him into the office. He got on the intercom, you know, the one that goes to all the classrooms. And he said, Ben Music, come to the office, please. Ben Music. And I went, oh, no, this isn't the way I wanted to apologize to my son. And just as he made that announcement, all of a sudden, bell rings, and now everybody's walking through the hallways. There's a couple of hundred students walking around. And here comes Ben walking down to the principal's office with 10 of his best buddies. This is not the way I wanted to say happy birthday to Ben. Ben came walking, Ben's right down here, by the way. Now he's not 16 anymore. But he came walking up to me, had a big smile on his face, and he knew I was there. And he was gonna play it all the way through. And I said, hey, Ben. He said, hey, Dad, all his buddies are there. And I said, you know, today's a big day for you, and I completely forgot to tell you happy birthday before you left for school this morning. And I'm sorry, I feel like a terrible dad. So, happy birthday. And Ben said, he said, Dad, I know you love me. He said, it's no big deal. I knew you hadn't forgotten me. And so we felt like everything was okay, but then it was time for me to leave. And time for them to go back to class. And I didn't quite know how to leave. You know, do I high-five him, shake his hand? You know, what am I don't want to embarrass him in front of his friends? And so I decided high-five was the best way. So I kind of went, okay, Ben, we'll see you tonight. And Ben went, completely let me hang. And I said, okay, I deserve that. You know, I get it. You know, it's payback time. And so I said, okay, no big deal. I'll see you tonight, Ben. And I started to walk away. And you know what my 16-year-old son did? Right there in front of God and 10 of his best buddies. he stepped in front of me like this, and he reached out his arms, and he gave me one of the biggest bear hugs I've ever had in my life. And I don't mean it was kind of like one of those like man hugs, like, hey, love you, man. But I mean it was a real hug. And it was long enough that I kind of grabbed him back like that, patted him on the shoulder, and I let go, and he didn't. He just kept hanging on. And I'm sure it wasn't 5 minutes, but it was a minute. It was a long hug. And finally, after about the second time I let go of him, I started to kind of tear up. I thought, now I'm going to really embarrass him. I'll start crying in front of his friends. But right in the middle of that hug with my son holding on to me, you know what I felt in that moment? I never really put words to it before. This feels like grace and peace. That hug from my son in front of all of his friends, it felt like mercy. It felt like treating me in a way I didn't deserve. It felt like I love you enough, Dad, to do something here that everybody's uncomfortable with. And my son demonstrated grace and peace to me in that moment. Christy and I were out to dinner one night with some friends, and our daughter Madison called me on the cell phone, and she was like 15 at the time, and she never called me. I thought there's something bad, something very wrong has happened in the world. And so I said, hey, Maddie, what's going on? And she said, Dad, I just had a question for you. I'm here at home, and my question is there water supposed to be pouring through our lights in our kitchen? I said, I don't know, let me ask your mom. No. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, not a little bit of water, Dad, but water is pouring out of the can lights in our kitchen from the ceiling, and it's just covered our kitchen. It's in our living room. It's going in our dining room. We raced home as quick as we could. We came walking in and discovered that there had been an upstairs toilet that had been overflowing for 9 hours. It had gone through the carpet, through the drywall, and was now pouring dirty toilet water all over downstairs. And it smelled like dirty toilet water. It was gross. And so I said to the kids, go change your clothes. We got a long night ahead of us. So I go change my clothes, and would you believe it? I'm right in the middle of cleaning up all this gross, dirty toilet water, and all of a sudden, boom, boom! I couldn't believe it. Somebody's at the door. So I go back in, I put my suit on, I go back in and answer the door. I didn't do that. I answer the door, and there's Louis and Rita. They're standing there with mops and a bucket. And they said, Pastor, we heard you had a problem. I said, I have no idea how you knew there was a problem, but we did have a problem. I explained what was going on. They said, well, you're to help. I said, oh, no. I said, no, this is the bad stuff. You don't want to do this. They said, yes, we do. We're here to help. I said, well, come on in. Louis and Rita come in, and we start working, and about 5 minutes later, boom, boom, I go back to the door. It's Tim and Darlene. Tim and Darlene said, hey, we heard you had a problem, Pastor. I said, well, come on in. It's a party. Tim and Darlene came in. They start working. Boom, boom. It's Phil Lockhill from the church. He's a carpet guy. He doesn't say anything. He just walks in and starts ripping up carpet everywhere. And before you know it, we've got like 30 people in our house. They're everywhere. They're in the living room. They're in the bedroom. Some people are looking in the refrigerator. There's laughing. And I'm down on my hands and knees in the kitchen, and I'm just this dirty toilet water everywhere, and I can hear people talking and laughing. And I start laughing. Because I'm thinking to myself, only in the church do you throw a party over dirty toilet water. But all of a sudden, I had the very same feeling that I had that moment when Ben hugged me in the hallway. This felt like grace and peace. That was a totally different feeling in the sense of the circumstances were different, but it was still grace and peace to me. It was still a group of people saying, we're going to share life with you. We're going to do life with you in the midst of the good times, the bad times, the valleys, the mountaintops, and even the dirty toilet water moments. This is what grace and peace feels like. This is saying to another person, may God treat you better than you deserve. This is grace and peace. getting on an airplane, which I do a lot these days. It was a Friday afternoon. That's the worst time to travel on an airplane because that's when all the business people are coming home. Everybody's grumpy. It's been a long week. They just can't wait to get home. And the plane's crowded, and they're about ready to shut the door to the plane. And all of a sudden, she came on. She was probably about 26 years old. She was a young mom. She came walking onto the plane. She had a screaming baby on her shoulder, screaming so loud it hurt your ears. She had a giant diaper bag that looked like it was about 3 diaper bags on her other shoulder. And she had on a leash in the other hand, I promise you it was a leash, a 3.5-year-old terrorist who was straining at the leash and pulling her through the airplane and slapping every airplane seat as he went by. And, I mean, you would have thought she had just unleashed the bubonic plague on that plane. Everybody was mad. And I have to admit to you, I had an unsanctified moment. I prayed a prayer of deliverance. And I said, oh God, if you love me, please don't let her sit by me. But then I looked at her face, and she looked exhausted. She looked so tired. I mean, it was almost like she was numb to everything that was going on. And it was at that moment that I heard Jesus speak in an audible, literal voice. And this is what he said. Through about a 70-year-old woman 4 seats behind me, she stood up on the airplane and she said, "Excuse me, dear, you look like you've got your hands full." And she said, "I got to tell you, I'm pretty good with babies. Can I take your baby from you while you put your stuff in the overhead?" And I love little boys. In fact, I've got an empty seat right here beside me. And if it's okay with you, he can sit with me on this plane ride and we can play games for the whole 3 hour flight. Can I help you? And I wish you could have seen the look of relief on her face. I wish you could see the look of relief on all of our faces. It was in that moment as she took that baby and she started patting that baby and she grabbed that little boy and the little boy came right up next to her. I looked up at that young mother and she was putting her things up and there were tears coming down her face. And I had the same feeling. It was the same feeling I had when Ben hugged me in the hallway. It was the same feeling I had in dirty toilet water in my house. I said, this is what grace and peace feels like. This is what it means to be a person who speaks wholeness and completeness and doesn't treat us as we deserve. This is how we speak to each other. Now, I want you to think as we close this morning, what's the context for Paul writing these words, grace and peace to you? When he wrote these words, do you think he was on a beach in Hawaii drinking lemonade, sitting on a hammock? I think you may know he was in a prison cell. And he wasn't just in any prison cell. He was in a Roman prison, which is the worst place you can imagine. Now, I don't want to go to prison today. I mean, I've seen the reality shows. I know prison doesn't look fun. But I can promise you, in a Roman prison, you're not pumping iron and watching ESPN all day and getting 3 square meals. That's not how it worked in a Roman prison. A Roman prison was a giant hole in the ground. And it was full of darkness, and it was wet, and it had rodents everywhere. It was violent. It was full of disease. In fact, most people didn't live beyond a few weeks in a Roman prison because of 3 reasons. Number 1, either you killed yourself because you couldn't bear to be there anymore, or number 2, someone killed you because it was such a violent place, or number 3, you starved to death. And you starved to death because Roman prisons did not feed you. The only way you got any kind of food is if your friends found out you were there, and they came and they either gave you money so you could buy food, or they brought you food. In fact, this whole letter to the Philippian church is really a giant thank you note from Paul, because there was a church 700 miles away that he had helped plant in Philippi, who heard Paul was now in prison for about the 5th time, and they had a board meeting. They said, somebody's got to do something about this. And so they did a collection. They got a bunch of money together. Then they said, is there anybody here on the board who can take like 3 months off work and go take this 700 miles to Paul in Rome? And some guy named Epaphroditus raised his hand. He said, I'll go. And we don't know exactly what happened to Epaphroditus on the way to Rome, but we know that he almost died, to the point that the Apostle Paul has to write in the book of Philippians back to them and say, by the way, Epaphroditus is going to make it. Whatever happened, it was pretty dangerous. But Paul was just so overwhelmed by the generosity of the church 700 miles away. He was saying, you have treated me with grace and peace. This is what it feels like. This is what it looks like in real life. This is what the church does. And he said, thank you for that. And I tell you that because grace and peace in your life is not just something that you feel. It's not an emotion you have. It's a reality that's true whether you're in the worst situation or whether you're in the best situation. The Apostle Paul was in the worst possible place he can be in his life. He probably thought, I could be executed at any moment. That's kind of what's always in the back of his mind. And yet, even there, in the worst moment of his life, he could still say, grace and peace to you. May God treat you better than you deserve. May He take the broken pieces of your life, put them back together again. Because grace and peace, my brother and sister, is not based on your circumstances. It's based on the reality of the relationship you have with Jesus Christ. And if that's right on the inside, it doesn't matter what's happening on the outside. And that's how you can become a grace and peace person. You can't force grace and peace. You can't work it up. You can't pull your socks up and say, I want to be a grace and peace person. It comes from reality of the grace and peace that's welling up in you. So grace and peace isn't based on your good or your bad circumstances. It's always based and rooted in Jesus. Now, I'm going to tell you something. There's a lot of people here who have been at a Christian college. Even here, they have not heard or experienced grace and peace in their life in a long time. They didn't come from a grace and peace situation, and maybe their whole lives feels like it's pretty chaotic right now. And what they need more than anything else is for the church to be the church. For the church to begin to treat each other and speak words of grace and peace to each other. What if every single day that you woke up, the first thing you did before you put your feet on the ground is you said, life. This is grace and peace. What if every breath you breathe started to feel like grace and peace? What if every time you were tempted to speak about somebody else in a bad way, what if you felt checked by the Spirit of God and said, wait a minute, no, that's not who we are. We are grace and peace people. What if every time one of your friends started raining condemnation down on themselves, you say, wait a minute, your faith is in Christ now. Your old things are passed away. All things have become new. You're a grace and peace person now. So begin to live it, think it, breathe it, extend it. You are a grace and peace person because of what Christ has done in you. And now you become the extension of His grace and peace to each other and to the world. So here's what I'd like us to do as we close this morning. This is a little awkward, but you can do it. When you came in, you fist bumped a few people. You said, hey, how you doing? What's up? I doubt any of you said grace and peace to each other. And more importantly, I doubt any of you really looked at the other person in their eyes and just said, I really love and appreciate you. And I'm going to tell you, I saw you do something in class. I saw you do something on the football field. I saw you do something in the calf. And watching you the way that you treated that other person, it was grace and peace to me. And I'm going to thank you for that. I think there's some people here today who, if they left feeling like there was someone offering them some grace and peace, it could give them the strength and the courage they needed to just keep it going on. So this is who we are. What if we started every conversation on campus this semester by just saying to each other, instead of, "What's up, dude?" What if you said, "Grace and peace to you. May God treat you better than you deserve. And may He take the broken pieces of your life and put them back together." So here's my invitation. Stand with me if you would. I want to ask you to turn to 5 or 10 people. Even 10 people. Not just your friends. And say some grace and peace to each other. And when you're done doing that, you can be dismissed. But you can go in grace and peace. Give some grace and peace to each other.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
I hope that you're making plans to be able to be at District Assembly in Decatur.